Hi, my name is Blair, and I am really excited today to talk about something that is a passion of mine, even within urban gardening. It is being able to grow high yields. So, high yield means growing the maximum amount that you can in an urban space. I'm in zone 8B, and I'm in the Austin area, and I am in an urban setting. So, I have about an 8,000 square foot lot. I know some gardener channels have 8,000 square foot garden beds. That is not us. We have very limited space and we want to kind of maximize the things that we can grow and be able to try them all out. And I only have limited space because I'm in a backyard garden. The first thing that I did to try to maximize my space is use raised beds. That allows me to bring in my own soil and use high quality, topsoil plus compost. And the other thing that really helps, and I'll kind of walk you through this, every time before I plant something, I go look up spacing from MI Gardener. Luke really seems to have kind of mastered that art of maximizing the space that he has. He has quite a bit more space than me, and he's in a completely different climate, but I think his spacing recommendations are fantastic. And also the trellising that I use to make my garden go vertical, which allows me to take a spot that, there's going to be a melon over there, and I'm taking like 1 by 3 foot of ground space. I'm also trying to grow it above another plant. And so I'm taking a really small space and growing something that would usually take, like, you'd do it and probably plant them 18 inches apart and, put 3 or 4 feet between the rows. And so that's a really great way to maximize space, is to go vertical. So let's talk about trellises. I have a bunch of different kinds, and I'm not too picky on exactly what to use. It's kind of what you have around, what's available, what's not terribly expensive, or some of the stuff was things that came from my yard. All right, this is my first recommendation as far as a trellis. This is a Hog Panel. If you went to Tractor Supply or whatever the local hardware store is in your area, you should be able to find something called a Hog Panel. And this is really great for trellising. It's really strong and stable. It's got good gaps, so when you're pulling things off at the end of the year, it's pretty easy. I just used some rebar stakes to attach it to the garden, to stick in the ground, and then we just wove it through. I don't know if you can see that, but we just wove it through the stakes, and that allowed us to interesting. That allowed us to really easily put this up. I mean, it took us a couple of minutes to get it installed. We did install it after the plants were pretty well established. Got some weeds in here. You should always be pulling weeds. That's what Luke and my gardener says, and I agree with him. Um, but I did kind of weave the plant a little bit through this. I'm trying to keep these plants mostly on this side, just because I've got tomatoes on the other side, and so I'm trying to keep the airflow between. I've got a trellis here and a trellis here. I'm trying to keep the airflow between the two really as much as possible. To attach the trellis is this. It's just like a wire. I think it's like a floral wire or something that I found online. And all I do is I take the tomato plant, because see how it's flopping down like that? Tomatoes will try to sprawl all across the ground, but what you want them to do is grow vertical to maximize our space here. And so I am just attaching this to the trellis to give it some structural support, and it's soaking wet, so that's exciting. It's very wet this morning. But there we go. So it's now attached to the trellis. This one could probably be attached here as well, because it was flopping over a fair amount too. And I just hook it into the trellis. Excuse me while my camera flips over and I reset everything. All right, so here's more of the wiring that I use, and I'm basically just taking, it's like a round of metal wire. I basically just take some clippers, cut a piece off, and take the wire. And I won't put it in every single spot. This thing's actually pretty stable. It seems like tomatillos have a really stable stake. Tomatoes tend to be a little more floppy, but I'm just coming in here and teasing this guy through. Actually, I think that'll be enough stability, but I'm going to throw a wire on here just in case. The The goal of using a trellis and also of tying the tomatoes to the trellis is to prevent the weight of the fruit, especially later in the season, from snapping branches. Particularly on a day where it's really, really wet, like today, the weight of a fruit plus the weight of the plant on a stem, even if I just wove it through, would create pressure on the stem and could cause it to snap. Also, tomatoes actually are not a naturally trellising plant. They're not like peas where they'll send out tendrils and grow up a stake. And so you have to train them up the trellis, and that means kind of tying different points on. And this is relatively easy to do, just where you see the tomato flopping over or not staying upright in a particular place. Just take a tie like I'm doing here and attach the plant to the trellis. You'll notice I'm already at the top of this trellis, so that's going to be a bit of a challenge this year. The second type of trellis you can use for tomatoes is just a tomato cage. So they come in different sizes. I actually think this one's just stuck less far in the ground than that one. They're actually originally the same height. These are the big ones, and I think I stuck that one a little bit lower in the ground because it wasn't as stable. They kind of break down over time. I'm not the hugest fan of them. As a matter of fact, I think the bottom row broke off of that one. This tomato actually probably won't get this tall, but it's a nice big stable container. The third method that I use for trellising or staking tomatoes is bamboo stakes. I used to have a lot of bamboo in my yard. I saved a ton of it, and I use these stakes a lot. You'll see, maybe I can show you up close. Basically, I just go in and use these metal wires to, really hard to do one-handed, to attach, to just kind of tie. And you'll see how loose I'm tying this. So I'm just tying I'm just twisting this around and tying it very loosely. This stem is going to get a lot bigger. I don't want it to be constricted by that, but I'm just giving it kind of some loose support. So it's not flopping over, and it's got that structural support here. You see how there's a second branch going out this direction? I'll probably come in and put a second, that's the problem with bamboo, it's a single stake, so I'll put a second stake over there. So over here, this is a really great trellis system for beans or peas. Basically what we did is we took some piping, put some corners on it, then took some wire and ran the wire up and down. There's a couple of cross items here. It's kind of curved in between. It's kind of come off over the years. I do also use bamboo stakes and stuff in here as needed. But this was great for the peas, just kind of grew themselves right up that, attached as needed. And that worked out pretty well. It's a little bit, I think it's gonna be a little bit tougher for the melons that I have planted here, I'm going to plant here. So I might actually even add some hog wiring to it, just to give them a little bit more structure and more things to grab onto, because there can be some kind of decent gaps in between these. And I think the hog wire actually does a better job. This was one of my original trellising options before I learned about hog wire. So it's good, but not as good as I think it's the hog wire. This is just another place where I used a bamboo stake. Those tomato cages can get expensive, and I had a ton of bamboo stakes. You can use really anything. Bamboo stakes are pretty resistant to rot though, and so I just attached, this guy to that, just giving it a little bit of structural support. Those are peppers. Peppers can get pretty big here in Texas. Not everywhere, but here in Texas they can get pretty big. In this case over here, I used tomato cages, smaller tomato cages for the peppers. That'll probably be big enough, though I have seen this plant get, I don't know, a foot or two taller than that. That particular sweet banana pepper I had a few years ago. This one right here is a bell pepper, and I had a bell pepper plant that got 3 or 4 feet tall last year, so I put a big stake in there. And that one I can really run up a single stake because it works with that. It'll kind of stay along the same stake. Another plug for vertical gardens. This isn't a way to trellis, but it is a way to grow vertically. I've literally got plants stacked on top of each other. There's, five tiers in there, and I think there's 6 pockets around the outside edge, so you can literally plant 30 different types of plants. Now you do have to be careful. Some of them are going to flow over each other, and so you can't truly fit 30 in there, 30 big plants, but in theory you can put 30 plants in there. This is my final trellis system that I have in right now. I've used some other things over the past. I'm actually kind of using this fence. This fence has been, I've grown some morning glories up it, which isn't like a fruiting plant, but the morning glories just kind of went up the fence and then piled on top of it. It was really lovely. So you can use fences or whatever is in your yard as long as your neighbors don't mind. It was flowers and my neighbor doesn't mind. But these trellises here, I'd say normally I would have used like a hog panel or something like that. These, there was a store that was going out of business near me, and I bought these trellises from the store's industrial set. So my goal here was to grow some green beans above my squash plants. And this is a really great way to expand your garden by taking a bed that was already full, but with a short crop and growing a tall crop behind it. Now you do want to make sure that the crops don't shade each other out. And that is one consideration, but generally you can take the vertical space behind your garden bed, just a little bit of soil in the bed, and grow vertically. So this is another place where I'm really trying to double down on the high yield. I've got eggplants growing below, and I'm planning to grow a pea plant up the trellis. This is a situation where you do need to add a little fertilizer to the soil, some extra compost, whatever it is, because these are all heavy feeders. And but you can plant plants very closely together. You just need to make sure they're all getting enough sun, and because that pea is going to go up the trellis, and the eggplants can kind of branch out sideways. I think they're going to be great. Now, eggplants, you can plant them between, I think it's like 14 to 18 inches apart. I think I did the absolute minimum here, and that's a little dicey here in Texas because eggplants get huge. I've had them, one would have taken over this whole bed. So I'm just planning to kind of push one to the right and one to the left, and then let the peas go up, and we'll see how it all works out. But I am also probably later in the season going to use this trellis as support for the eggplants because they do tend to get big. Their fruit is very heavy. This isn't trellising, but I noticed there is a stake, a bamboo stake actually, in this tree, and that's just helping it grow straight. That's something you think about if you're growing trees, just making sure that they're growing straight, because where your sunlight is going to cause them to bend one direction or another, and a tree is going to be healthier, happier, and stronger if it grows straight. So I think this stake is a great idea, and I wouldn't have thought of it if they hadn't done it, but it's a great idea. This is a final example of using what you have. This fence is fantastic. My neighbors installed the fence. I asked them if I could grow things on it, and they said sure. Especially I mostly grow flowers, but I think if I put a few bean plants on here or something like that, that would be fine. One thing about this bed, it doesn't really get great sun in the early spring and late fall, and so if I were going to grow something over here, it would probably be a summer loving crop because that's the time when it gets the most sun, and even still it's a little bit more limited. So I'm mostly growing flowers over here. Also, it's kind of the main thoroughfare through my backyard, so try to make it look at least a little pretty. I would love for this to be a strawberry bed or something like that, but I just don't think it has enough winter sun for that. But you'll see there's a bean plant that's actually just a sweet pea, which is more for flowers than for anything else, but that's growing up the trellis, the quote-unquote trellis there, which is actually a fence in this case, which is a great solution. I said you can use anything as a trellis. This is my compost bed, and there are some volunteers growing in there, but I would not necessarily use chicken wire. It's so tight the way that it's wound. I could just imagine if you had anything that was actually going to grow up it would be a nightmare to pull back out at the end of the season because the holes are so tight. Just pulling the vines back out would be really a pain, and so I'd recommend something more like the hog wire. It's going to feel like it's really not dense and not like it's like the wires are really spread apart, but once your plant really starts growing in, hog wire is a much better solution. It's wider apart. You'll see how the plants are kind of weaved through. You just don't want those really small holes because it's going to be difficult to right a plant if it goes through and goes the wrong way, or and at the end of the season it's going to be a nightmare to pull out. So I highly recommend these wider apart, and I'm not even sure I would go with the panels. There are panels that are that have smaller spacing like this, more like my fence over there. But this is kind of the width that I would go with. This is as wide as you, or as narrow as you need, and it's gonna be a lot easier to manage. All right, just want to say a quick thank you for hanging out with me. I hope you really learned a lot about trellising and how to grow high yield in a small space. I think vertical is the best way to go. Also, planting things close together, but not too close. There is something to be said for growing plants closer together and maximizing your yield, especially in an urban setting. You know, I love gardening. I love being able to grow all kinds of different things. And the only way I can really do that is if I don't use farm spacing, but rather use high yield kind of urban, what I would call urban spacing. So anyway, thanks for hanging out with me. Thanks for listening to my garden ramblings. And I hope that you are able to get a little inspired from it, grow something amazing, and have a wonderful day. Happy gardening.